so I shall start. So thank you for inviting me to share some of my research and early findings around the subject of music and dance during the interregnum. And I say early findings because as the archives have reopened, every researcher under the sun has booked a spot. And there is more that I'm going to be exploring shortly, so this is only the start. But I do believe I have found some initial findings that give us a clearer picture of music and dance scenes between 1640-ish until the Restoration in 1660. I would like to start by saying that it isn't my intention to rewrite the history books or the history of the English Civil War. There are many good and well-researched histories out there, and nor is it my intention to discount or discredit those academics that specialise in music of the interregnum. Again, there are some very good resources out there, and I have found Tamsin Lewis's online lectures on YouTube really useful and can highly recommend them. But as Dr. Patrick Little states in his article on music at the court of King Oliver, traditionally, music and musicians are simply a quick anecdote or only mentioned briefly alongside other contexts. He has written about some of the music played and the musicians who were placed in Oliver Cromwell's employment. However, I'm going to twist it all again and state that I am widening that picture and focusing on the musicians themselves. There is a magical place north of London called Yorkshire. We like to think of it as God's own country, and I have tried to focus some of my research there, or should I say right here. My general PhD research, as Annette told you, is looking at the role of the musician in England between 1650 and 1750. And this is done from multiple perspectives and to reconsider the wide-ranging role of the English instrumental musician and their musical skill sets within a variety of performance situations, particularly as they developed and were shaped by volatile political and socio-cultural backdrops. My overall aim will bring the musician to the forefront in all of their forms and guises. I came to realise, not too long ago actually, that music and its different performance pathways such as theatre, church, street and so on during the Civil War, the interregnum, and the role that Oliver Cromwell played was just not as simple as I thought it was. And it's certainly not as simple as we were taught at school. We were told that basically as soon as Cromwell was in charge, music stopped. Kaput, that's it. It suggests a curtain of silence descended onto England and that there was suddenly no sound at all. And this is simply not the case. And it really isn't real life not to have sound. And the real story is far more complex and inconsistent than I had initially anticipated. And I'm still amazed that some of these beliefs about the Puritans' music still exist. So I would like to start by giving a very, very brief timeline of the English Civil War and Cromwell himself with a few significant events. This will set the time period in which this presentation is set. I will then discuss evidence to suggest what music and dance were performed during the interregnum, how we might perceive the role of the musician within that, and any potential consequences from the numerous ordinances created within this time frame. While I've attempted to keep this presentation in a logical, chronological order, the complexities of overlap and certain events have caused me to backtrack a few times, but please bear with me and you can ask me questions at the end. There we go. So within this presentation, I have attempted to answer several very generic questions to lead into this topic. What was music performance and theatre like during Charles I's reign? What happened to music performance and theatre during the Civil War period itself? And what happened to music performance and theatre during the interregnum when Cromwell was in charge in London? And if possible, evidence for further afield. Oops, there we go. So here is the most very brief timeline ever in just a few significant events. So it goes this way if you can follow the arrow. So I'll just go through a few of them. But the events leading to Charles I's death and the creating of the interregnum was a complex one, and one that affected all aspects of life. Parliament was governed by the Presbyterians, who heeded strict rules and regulations on lifestyle based around religious observations, not entirely dissimilar to the Puritans. but they were both contrary to those of Charles I and his lifestyle, which was associated with popery and excess. Amongst this power battle between Parliament and the Royalists, Cromwell was in fact an independent. He quickly rose through the ranks of the army, becoming known as Old Ironside, due to his success at Marston Moor in 1644. In the most simplistic terms, it was due to Parliament's lack of military might and the support from fellow Puritans that changed the power in Parliament from a Presbyterian hold to an independent and Puritan hold, with Cromwell at the head of the new model army with the assistance of the self-denying Ordinance in 1645. From then on, this particular power play continued, although not easily. I will not go into details about the short and long parliaments, but on the 20th of April, 1653, he brought his military into the Rump Parliament and disbanded it, saying, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." This act by Cromwell mirrored Charles I when he did exactly the same thing in January 1642. There was another attempt at the Barebones Parliament, and it was run by the most amazing name, Praise God Barebones. But that was disbanded quickly, and Cromwell was chosen, like the Sovereign of Parliament, to become Lord Protector. This was a confusing time for everyone, but the purpose of this presentation is to explore the music and performance practices during this very confusing time. Now, I will attempt to address the first question I have posed myself. What was music performance and theatre like during Charles I's reign? I want to set the scene in 16th century London, so we're going to go a wee bit further back. I won't be going into any great detail, but just enough to provide an insight. 16th century London was awash with theatres and entertainments placed outside of the city limits where the jurisdiction was limited. This allowed a greater freedom of entertainment such as cockfighting, brothels, bear baiting, and of course, theatre. Theatres like the Swan, as shown here. These were typically outdoor seasonal theatres. The circles show where the musicians were placed, ta-da, and please note the trumpeter on the roof, and he is alerting the start of the performance. During the winter months, private theatres were created in inns and other indoor premises to a fee-paying audience. This would have been a much smaller and intimate venue, more comfortable than outside theatres. Therefore, entry came with a higher ticket price. In 1596, the desire of the King's Men's Players and their leader, James Burbage, for a more profitable and stable theatre experience, away from quibbling landlords, drove them to purchase the defunct Blackfriars Monastery, which became the Blackfriars Theatre. Due to a petition by the local residents against establishing a low-class theatre in their neighbourhood, however, Burbage was forced to rent the Blackfriars space to children's troupes from the children of the chapel. Its connection to the Chapel Royal, albeit brief as they left in 1610, brought highly trained, well-known court musicians to play for the children's performances, including Nathaniel Giles, their master, Philip Rossiter, who was lutenist to the King, composer and theatre manager, and numerous others. At this time, the Blackfriars Theatre audiences demanded the very best musicians. When the residency of the children of the chapel ended, the King's men were finally able to use Blackfriars in the manner in which Burbage had originally planned. This endeavour, which catered to the elite who could afford tickets and more refined aesthetics, hired musicians of similar high standing for their own musical consort, said to be the best in London. Much of the evidence about the performances at Blackfriars comes from letters and diaries. In the 1630s, the Master of Revels at the Inns of Courts, responsible for organising the traditional masque for the court of Charles I, was a lawyer, Bulstrode Whitelock. I love his name. He played an important part in the story of musical performance and theatre during the interregnum. In chronicling his frequent theatre attendance, he often included descriptions of the music, praising its quality. In his discussion of the music played before the main play, he reveals the equal or possibly even greater draw of the music to the advertised entertainments. And as he says here, he was so conversant with the musicians and so willing to gain their favour, especially at this time, that I composed an air myself with the assistance of Mr. Ives and called it Whitelock's Coranto. So this is obviously a very popular piece of music. From Whitelock's descriptions, academics have been able to establish, one, that Blackfriars musicians were well regarded and that many came just to hear them play. 2, the names of the musicians associated with the 1634 Mass Triumph of Peace, more than likely performed at Blackfriars, as well as other theatre productions, Chapel Royal and King's Music as well, and were therefore elite musicians. And finally, Whitelock has afforded a glimpse into what types of activities amateur musicians like himself participated in, even with the help of the composer Simon Ives, such as writing their own pieces and private or home playing. This, of course, does not tell us what other musical activities took place at this time. This particular display of musicianship was quite an elite activity. In comparison to private theatre productions, those performed by the itinerant theatrical troupes were certainly more accessible to a wider range of society. These travelling troupes, also known as wanderers and strollers, would travel with the fairs and other public entertainments as they had done since medieval times. They performed in portable booth theatres that contained all the sets and theatre paraphernalia, or on a simple temporary raised platform. Sometimes they simply performed on the ground. Offerings depending on the group. Often, to cut down on costs and increase individual takings, many of the actors also played the instruments. Famous Elizabethan examples include Will Kemp and Richard Tarleton, who are credited as being accomplished musicians. It might not be out of the realms of possibility that local musicians were also enlisted for performances, especially if the troupe travelled the same circuit regularly and knew the professional, semi-professionals in the area. And this is true of the King's Men, who travelled regularly to Yorkshire, stopping at York and Doncaster up to 1642. The Stuart Masques are well known, and both Charles I and his Queen Henrietta Maria enjoyed performing in them. The connection of the Masque to the Inns of Court is well established, and Bulstrode Whitelock, as the Master of Revels, was most familiar in the organisation and implementation of them. So to answer this first question, or at least explore this first question about musical performance, dance and theatrical performance, it is very clear that the travelling routes of gentlemen performance and troops, as a way round of the Vagrancy Act of 1572, which was still very much in play, plus the regular fairs and travelling merchant stalls and events that took place, sees the whole of England, on the face of it, enjoying musical entertainments of all kinds. Now, I haven't spoken about those musicians who were charged under the Vagrancy Act, because either they were not tied to a patron or they didn't have a licence to perform. Also, that the plays, poems, songs and dialogues performed must not contain any overt or obvious blasphemy or potential treasonous remarks that could also result in punishment. The court rolls and accounts contain some information about these individuals, but details are very sparse, if you can even find them. But I'm going to continue to paint an auditory and visual picture of 17th century London. So the broadside ballads were also a source of music throughout the City of London. Now, starting in the 16th century and growing in popularity in the 17th century, these 1 penny, cheaply printed broadsheets were easily obtainable by all of London society, and that removed geographical and social boundaries. Quite often, ballads describe significant events, royal procession, executions, funerals, a political event, or they were just full of gossip. The peddlers and hawkers would sing the ballads they were selling, creating an interesting and dynamic soundscape to the City of London. This example that I've shown here is on the execution, or the trial and execution, of Charles I in 1649. As you can see at the top of the image, it states the tune. People would have known these popular tunes, and they were reused over and over again, so the broadside ballads are a popular source of contrafactum. This was published again, incidentally, in 1656, no doubt reminding everyone of the justification of the Civil War and the execution of Charles I. But I'm just going to play a little bit now.
King Charles was once a prince of great state, but yet he died a death unfortunate. Oh, he is gone, and now hath left us here, and God doth know what courses we shall steer. Now my sad story to you I'll relate.
So quite often these were on both sides of the paper, so these were very long songs sometimes. Okay. Some moderate Puritans balked at the fervour that Cromwell and his followers practised. But even since Elizabethan times, there was discontent from the Puritans and Presbyterians, and they regarded theatre as excessive and vulgar, and they described the music in the same fashion, and something to be stamped out as a low-order activity. However, in 1632, and I believe catching and reflecting the mood of these influential individuals, William Prynne published his Histriomastics. It's a book of objections to the theatre, and he calls it effeminate. The women actors were whores. It was unchristian. The plays were performed on religious days, and so on. This, of course, created consternation amongst those that partook in theatre, particularly as women did not act on stage at this time. And the only woman who was publicly known to have a speaking part in the royal masques was Henrietta Maria. So this was an obvious slight against the Queen. So Prynne had his ears chopped off. The difference between court theatre and the masques and that of the likes of the Globe were marked contrasts, but they were all placed under the same umbrella. Low order, excess, filth and villainy, and mockery, and it was inextricably linked to the royalty and popery. The public chopping off of Prynne's ears, however, only motivated the growing discontent with the apparent excess of the royals. It is worth noting, though, that in 1636, William Strode was commissioned to write a play for the royal couple on their visit to Oxford, and he wrote The Floating Island. It is a blatant mocking of Prynne, his ears, or lack of, and the Puritans. So the royalists gave as good as they got. From this example, only a few years before the start of the downfall of Charles I, one can imagine that the power would remain in the royalist hands and that the Puritans' independence were not really a threat. However, it's really obvious over the next few years that this was really not the case. The threat to the royal family was very real. This next part will address the second question posed by this presentation. What was music like during the Civil War period? This is an interesting bit now, because I would like to go over some of the many, many ordinances that Parliament put into place from 1642. The first ordinance, issued on the 2nd of September 1642, and please, I do not expect you to read all of this. I've tried to highlight some of the main bits. This one ordered the closure of theatres, playhouses and gaming houses, and later animal fighting. The Globe Theatre was pulled down by the Puritans in 1644, so 2 years after this was. But this first ordinance, if you look at it now, it's trying to really get to the old heartstrings, because obviously the distress of Ireland that's going on at the moment, the cloud of blood by a civil war, and all, you know, everything's just sad, basically. So while all these sad causes and set times of humiliation do continue, public stage plays shall cease and be forborne, instead, which are recommended for the people of this land, blah, 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 repentance, reconciliation, and peace with God, etc., etc. Anyway, that didn't work. So they put in a more stringent ordinance on the 2nd of October, 1647, and it carries on. So this time, common play shall be committed to jail. So now they're threatening to throw people into jail. That still didn't work, so they did another one. And you can see how, I mean, I didn't have any room to put this all on. They are declared to be rogues. Stage galleries and boxes were pulled down. Anybody who was a spectator or they were in the theatre, they were going to be charged 5 shillings. And it just goes on and on and on, and the list carries on. And it also includes whipping as well. And there's more, because that worked for a little bit, but not anymore. So then on the 28th of August, 1654, they got rid of dancing and Morris dancing and maypoles and stage plays or anything else that teachers, or as you can see, ignorant and insufficient ministers. So anything like that. And then 1649, so I know I've backtracked a bit there, they're trying to have an act against unlicensed and scandalous books and pamphlets. And I mean hawkers and ballad singers to be sent to the House of Correction. So I think we can be forgiven for thinking that the Puritan independent government was completely against fun. It is interesting to note, though, that there is no direct suppression of music making itself in these ordinances. Most of the pastimes mentioned, the cards, dice, ale, singing, dancing, etc., are not to be done on the Lord's Day or the Sabbath. And while it is not entirely clear, playing in taverns, etc., and the punishments thereof are based around the Vagrancy Act. In his history of the interregnum music, in his book, The Musical Grammarian, Roger North reports that while music languished at court and at theatres, it continued to flourish privately, for many chose to fiddle at home than go out and be knocked on the head abroad. And this paints quite a vivid image of what might happen to the musician if caught playing in public, or to the musical audience should they be caught attending public performance, symptomatic of a confusing time for musicians and their place in society. In 1643, Ordinances appointed parliamentary and Presbyterian licenses in place of the traditional royal and episcopal censors. This created a situation where writers had to work around the censorship in place. And as you can imagine, as positions and posts were filled with individuals of varying levels of strength of belief, censorship was no easy or consistent matter. Richard Lovelace is an example when in 1649 he published Lucasta. Now, although he had spent time in prison for his royalist connections and support, Cromwell and his Secretary of State, John Thurlow, Cromwell and his Secretary of State, John Thurlow, increased the severity of censorship in the 1650s, just as King Charles and Archbishop Laud had done in the 1630s, and this pattern continues. This increase of censorship meant that Cromwell had effectively stopped anyone being able to print anything that might go against the present system, namely himself, and this included plays and music. Oh yes, more. Yet in 1644, the ardent Puritan John Milton, a poet and the Latin secretary, published his treatise of education, and he added music into the desired curriculum, and essentially encouraging students after a hard day's study to play, listen and learn music together. He also published his Areopagitica, basically imploring Parliament not to censor books and other publications. I mean, this can be seen as a first argument for freedom of speech. Please note, though, that this was designed for the elite students, as poorer families could not possibly send their children for this type of education. But we can see from such publications from an eminent political character such as Milton that it was still considered gentlemanly and even necessary for musical and dancing skills to be learned, even in a private domestic setting. And this can be seen when Roger Lestrange, in his Truth and Loyalty Vindicated, he wrote in 1662, "Being in St. James's Park, I heard an organ touched in a little low room of one of Mr. Hingston's. I went in and found a private company of 5 or 6 persons. They desired me to take up a viol and bear a part. I did so. By and by, without the least colour of a design or expectation, in comes Cromwell. He found us playing, and as I remember, he left us." So Lestrange was a royalist, even though he had shown support to Cromwell and received a pardon. And he was then put in charge of licenses and the press. And I can't help but feel that that would have helped musicians and performers somewhat. There were incidents where illegal or clandestine theatre performances were closed down. Many got round the loopholes in the ordinances by having entertainments like rope walking or rope dancing, which we think is the trapeze, and juggling as interludes, which were acceptable. Drolls were popular, and a way of putting on performances that were semi-dramatic, full of music and dance, country dancing and those of the dance suites, and therefore not entirely considered illegal. After the 1642 suppression of theatre, it wasn't just musicians out of work. Actors in London wanted to return to work, and in January 1644, they wrote the Actors' Remonstrance or Complaint for the silencing of their profession and banishment from their several playhouses. They concentrate on the morality of a lot of the plays and entertainments on offer, stating that Blackfriars, the Cockpit and Salisbury Court have purged obscene material, particularly as bear baiting and other blood sports were still ongoing, so they didn't think it was fair. Even though this petition was unsuccessful and more than likely contributed to the second more stringent documented performances around this time. The Red Bull Theatre was associated with the Drolls throughout the 1640s. But on the 20th of December 1649, it was raided by soldiers and a number of actors were arrested and imprisoned and their clothes and properties confiscated. Soldiers raided the Salisbury Court on the 6th of October 1647 during a performance of A King and No King by Beaumont and Fletcher, some of the authors spoken about in the Actors' Remonstrance as being morally appropriate. On the 1st of January 1649, the authorities raided all 4 of the London theatres at the same time. So the actors at Salisbury Court Theatre, the Cockpit Theatre were arrested. A rope dancer was arrested at the Fortune Theatre, but the actors at the Red Bull Theatre managed to escape. So in March 1649, a couple of months later, the authorities destroyed the interior of the Salisbury Court Theatre, the Fortune and the Cockpit too, making them useless for public performances. Ultimately, clandestine semi-dramatic, music, dancing, poetry, singing and other types of performances continued throughout the 1640s despite the threat of punishment. But where did the musicians sit in society at this time? It is hard to say, but in London, elite musicians and their friends, colleagues, professional and otherwise, would continue to play in a roundabout way. And by Cromwell disbanding the King's Music and the Chapel Royal, this encouraged the musicians to become more creative. They became teachers, they published works, and were still on the roll call for Cromwell when he needed musicians. Other musicians, I believe, would not have fared so well without these contacts. Further afield in Yorkshire, there is an ordinance against licensed and unlicensed alehouses, suppressing alehouses and activities that encourage or support robberies, burglaries, highwaymen, horse races, cockfights, bear baiting, stage plays, idle persons, foreigners and papists. But this was only issued in January-February of 1655. In addition, there are records from 1642 on the Guild Roll mentioning several musicians that were added to it. And in 1648, letters appointing music and dancing masters to teach in the Lancashire area. So far from the closure of theatres and musical entertainments, so far the evidence is suggesting that in the north, the suppression of musical entertainments was not evidenced until the 1650s. It must be borne in mind that some of the largest battles took place in the north during the Civil War, so there was still a lot of recovery to do from that, but this is where I will be continuing my research. Household inventories from local manors, however, support the domestic and private music home music making through listing of instruments in the inventories, although this is not always reliable as the accounts tend to relate to estates and not necessarily to personal items. So that can result in no mention of instruments or only some kind of instruments like harpsichords. And presumably because they are bigger, more substantial than handheld instruments. Now the Civil War technically finished in 1651. So this next section will attempt to address the question about what music was like during the interregnum. This ballad is an example of one where it was passed by licensing, and initially it is about an old love story between a man and a woman, but it clearly references royalists and popery and the simpler Puritan way of marriage. Love songs and ballads are very typical ballad fare, and this particular one has been manipulated to incorporate the Puritan message. It's hard not to think of this actually as a sung lesson. So in this ballad, the woman is saying to the man that she wants a ring and ribbons and everything that her forefathers had if they are to get married. And the man is saying he loves her and they don't need any of that. The last verse states, with the young man finishing the song, "These are but ceremonies, belong to popery, therefore we will not use them still, but all such toys defy, will hand in hand together conjoin with joyful cheer. Few words we'll need, I'll do the deed with the sweet cavalier." And I don't think that message could be any clearer. This next ballad, which I will play a little of in a minute, is quite clear. It talks about a young man wanting to experience music, wine and women and all that life has to offer, but then he loses it all and ends up eating with pigs. But his merciful father takes him back and loves him again because he has given all of that up. Again, I think this message is entirely clear, and the figurative nature of excessive royalist behaviour and pure Puritan living is quite a common trope at this time. I shall just play a little bit now. This is the very last verse.
This worthy parable Christ he did tell unto the comforters of Christians each one. Although by our wickedness we do rebel, yet by true repentance our Father of heaven doth pity our case, receiving us to grace, and joys everlasting with him to take pain. Young men, remember delights are but vain, and after sweet pleasure comes sorrow and pain.
Sweet pleasure, then sorrow and pain. Delightful. So the contradictions in approach to purification of the Cromwellian court are clear and evident through musical and dancing practices at the time. When Cromwell became Lord Protector in 1653, he moved into Whitehall with his family. In 54, he took the royal apartments and behaved in every way as king. He sat in Charles's seat. He was referred to as Your Highness, although his title was officially Lord Protector, a king in all but name, and openly enjoyed, as did his family, all that was on offer. John Dryden and Milton visited him, and he took in his employ the Whitehall organist, John Hingston, and this is the Hingston that Roger Lestrange mentions. Hingston was paid £100 annually for this position, and he notes that Cromwell was particularly fond of listening to Hingston and two of his boys singing the anthems of Richard Daring. Strange, as they were Catholic anthems. Little is known about the reduction of official musical practice of the Protectorate Church, although it is known that metrical psalms were sometimes used. It is known that Cromwell personally enjoyed musical entertainments at his weekend home in Hampton Court with his own court musicians, exactly in the same way as Charles I did. He had the organ removed from the Chapel Royal in his religious fervour to simplify and purify the church, but he had the organ from Oxford installed at Hampton Court to enjoy at his leisure. He also enjoyed other private musical entertainments, including the music and dancing featured at both of his daughters' weddings in 1657. Frances, his daughter, had a simple civil ceremony, but followed that the next day by an extravagant wedding feast at Whitehall that featured 48 violins, 50 trumpets, and much mirth with frolics, besides mixed dancing, a thing heretofore accounted profane, until 5 o'clock of the morning. Now, Cromwell himself apparently danced till the early hours of the morning as well, and he had commissioned songs specifically for the occasion from Marvel. While public spectacle had ceased, private spectacle was still taking place. This activity is concordant with the research by the historian Scholes, who posits that Puritans were not against music itself, but specifically against the elaborate and ornate church music and the public exhibition of plays and dancing. I take the message here is to do what you like in private, just don't let anyone else know about it. Cromwell was known for using music to entertain guests at court just as the king would have done. And on the 28th of April 1654, a Dutch ambassador recorded, "Yesterday at noon, we were invited to dinner by His Highness, the Lord Protector, where we were nobly entertained. 12 trumpeters were ready, sounding against our coming. The music played all while we were at dinner. The Lord Protector, dinner over, had us into another room where the Lady Protectress and others came to us, where we had also music and voices and a psalm sung." So there's a lot of music where apparently there is not meant to be any music. In 1653, Cromwell sent Bulstrode Whitelock to Sweden on a diplomatic mission, and the Queen of Sweden was so taken with the music and the musicians that she asked for copies of the pieces performed. Now, this is not a sign of dying or destroyed musical practices in England. Also in 1653, Cromwell entertained the Portuguese ambassador with a masque called Cupid and Death, and that's what was playing at the beginning of this. It was one of the excerpts from that. And this was a Stuart author, Shirley. Now, this masque had the same format as other courtly masques. There was singing, dancing, dialogue, and even an anti-masque, but without any audience participation. This is evidencing something contrary to popular belief about Cromwell. There is also a vague suggestion, though, that the reason there wasn't any audience participation and dancing is because he didn't know how to dance. Musicians appear also to have provided such entertainment at their own homes. Henry Law, whose brother William Laws, both of Chapel Royal and Charles I musicians, and William, who died in 1645 in the Civil War. So Henry often had music at his own house, as witnessed by the Duchess of Newcastle. Another such musician was Mr. Davis Mell, who appeared on Whitelock's list of musicians and partial composer for the Triumph of Peace in 1634. He was one of Cromwell's house musicians and would become co-master of the music for Charles II's 24 fiddlers. One of his gatherings in 1652 was attended by Huygens, a Dutch diplomat who recounted that Mr. Mell played music with other musicians. This diary entry demonstrates that these musicians, whilst not strictly employed by the court anymore, continued their professional musical activities, and people in Hugin's positions who were involved in the day-to-day running of government were permitted to attend within their homes. This also provides an example of the active networking musician inviting potential fee-paying patrons into their homes to hear concerts, through which they would widen their network of supporters, and this increased monetary and social capital. As an elite musician, Mel was able to charge a fee only affordable by the upper classes in London, thereby creating an exclusive audience, narrowing the reach of new music at this time. Mel's further employment provides us with a glimpse into the realities of former court musicians. In 1655, at the grand old age of 51, Mel became an apprentice to one Richard Morgan of the Clockmakers' Company. Now, this appears initially to be a very strange jump from a highly skilled musician to an apprentice clockmaker. But the records suggest that things were not quite as they seemed. Mel had a very short apprenticeship, 6 months in fact, and had 2 of his own apprentices. So it appears, rather than a master clockmaker, Mel became a clock dealer that specialised in musical clocks, and who better to sell a musical clock than a well-known musician? This was not just an interesting hobby by an important musician and composer, but a way that Mel could supplement his income without losing status. The audiences who came to hear concerts at his home must have provided a ready-made clientele for his musical clocks. His particular situation provides clear insight into the plight of the musician at this time and the innovative ways they were able to supplement their income. But while musicians of Mel's status had access to profitable possibilities before them, it seemed less likely those of lesser rank or ability could have afforded this and would have suffered greatly. In 1657, Mel, Hingston and other well-known musicians petitioned the new council, or committee I should say, for the advancement of music, which was set up by the Privy Council. They were unsuccessful, but it shows the change in the way music was being used and dealt with and how they could approach the authorities about it. Against popular belief, there was an inordinate amount of publishing taking place throughout the 1650s. This is just a few. I'm going to dash on because I also have a list here as well. And this just illustrates just a few key publications around music and performance. The interesting ones for me are the catches, very popular in taverns, but clearly can also be for domestic and private singing. The court airs, proving that there was, strictly speaking, no actual court, but the music from there was very popular. And around 50 of the pieces were from the deceased William Laws of Charles I's court. So this is very much a royalist link. Another one I really like is the Parenthea, or Maidenhead, which you can see a picture here. This was originally published in 1611. And the fact that it's approximately around 50 years old at this point, I think shows that these things were of interest still. So, in addition to purely musical entertainments in private homes, there is evidence that theatrical entertainment also continued similarly for a fee-paying audience. Now, in February 1653, the floor of an upper room in a tavern in Witney collapsed during an Elizabethan play called Musidorus. The preacher John Rowe capitalised on this and preached or spouted, depending on your point of view, anti-theatre rhetoric, stating that God had made the floor collapse to end the play. And of course, in 1656, Davenant composed his theatrical entertainment, The Siege of Rhodes, arguably the first English opera, due to the inclusion of dialogue in a recitative style. Davenant wrote the text as a poem. Now, historian Judy Parks argues that the libretto of The Siege of Rhodes presents a mixture of aesthetic and political statements against the current Commonwealth and Cromwell's government. The powerful Ottoman Empire against Mediterranean forces represent Cromwell's Commonwealth and the issues concerning the monarchy. The censorship law of the time required Davenant to seek permission from the government in order to allow a fee-paying public performance at his house, home in Rutland House. Now, traditionally, this permission was granted by the Master of Revels, a deputy of the Lord Chamberlain, but during the Commonwealth, these roles were changed or eradicated, including the role of Master of Revels. And between 1642 and 60, the redundant incumbent of the role was Sir Henry Herbert, who started court actions against Davenant, incidentally, because of his 1650s performances. Nevertheless, Davenant had supporters in both Whitelock, now the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and a great supporter of theatre and music, and John Thurlow, the head of intelligence. So while the Puritans barred drama and exuberant public dancing, musical performances in recitative style was accepted due to its favour with Cromwell. Davenant shows his true wordsmanship and also his versatility by introducing this piece as a representation by the art of perspective in scenes and the story sung in recitative music. Now you can see in the preface here, the music was composed and both the vocal and instrumental is exercised by the most transcendent of England in that art. And perhaps not unequal to the best masters abroad, but being recitative and therefore unpracticed here, though of great reputation amongst other nations, the very attempt of it is an obligation to our own. Now, Davenant's inclusion of recitative appears to have been primarily viewed as a way around Cromwellian censorship. The foreign practice of recitative enabled him to get his theatrical entertainment through scrutiny, and as such inadvertently created what scholars consider the first English opera, supported by Davenant's creation of the term semi-opera in the libretto. The composers and musicians working alongside Davenant in the Siege of Rhodes also played an equally vital role in the development of this entertainment piece, as it was their experiments into English recitative which enabled a performance to take place to a fee-paying audience. They, like Davenant, benefited, suggesting a mutual and cohesive ambition among the creative talent involved. The music was composed by 5 different composers. The vocal was Henry Lawes, Matthew Locke and Henry Cooke, and instrumental by Charles Coleman and George Hudson. The composers also played the main character roles alongside other actors. And the libretto also provides detailed descriptions of when the music will be played, including entry and exit music, which is an unusual practice for the time. All of this helps to highlight the importance of the musical offering in this theatrical entertainment, again, seemingly to avoid censorship. Davenant's discussion of the recitative from the preface states that musicians involved with the production were the most skilled, but clearly this does not involve all musicians. However, with the plethora of publications, and in this case Playford's desire to attract more customers using musical teaching books as it was a way of introducing these songs to the wider public sphere, therefore, within the 1650s, the role of the musician seems clearer cut than in the last decade, as long as the music is played suitably and within the bounds of licensing and censorship. This does not account for private and domestic settings. There is evidence of this in Anthony Wood's diaries in Oxford, and I shall read, this is an odd version, it's an abridged version of his diary, and it uses Wood's own language, but almost as a description in third person. So 1656, Woods had genuine skill in music and frequented the weekly meetings of musicians in the house of William Ellis, late organist of St. John's College, situate and being in a house opposite to that place whereon the theatre was built. So regular weekly meetings. Now this is interesting. Now Woods had before learned to play on the violin by the instruction of Charles Griffith and afterwards of John Parker, one of the university musicians. He was now advised to entertain one William James, a dancing master, by some accounted excellent for that instrument, and the rather because it is said that he obtained his knowledge of dancing and music in France. So again, I find that quite an interesting thing. Now, what is interesting here is that he then says that he was with him for half a year and gained some improvement, but found him not a complete master of his faculty, as Griffith and Parker were not. And to say the truth, there was yet no complete master in Oxford for that instrument, meaning the violin, because it had not been hitherto used in consorts among gentlemen, only by common musicians who played but 2 parts. The gentlemen in private meetings with Woods played 3, 4 and 5 parts, all with viols as treble viol, tenor, counter tenor and bass, with either an organ or harpsichord joined with them, and they esteemed a violin to be an instrument only belonging to a common fiddler, and could not endure that it should come among them for fear of making their meeting seem to be vain and fiddling. When Charles II comes back, obviously we know that he has the 4 and 20 violins. Later on, so just after Cromwell had died in 1658, Davies Mell visited Oxford, and Woods did give him a very handsome entertainment in the tavern called the Salutation. The company did look upon Mr. Mell to have a prodigious hand on the violin, and they thought that no person, as all in London did, could go beyond him. But when Thomas Baltzar, an outlander, came to Oxford the next year, they had other thoughts of Mr. Mell, who, though he played far sweeter than Baltzar, yet Baltzar's hand was more quick and could run it insensibly to the end of the fingerboard. So there's quite a change in attitude then towards violins, and clearly not common musicians. So to attempt to address the last question I posed for this presentation, it seems that the role of the musician, particularly the trained pedagogical musician, was much in demand. There is clearly a demarcation between instruments and associated class, but also a widening of musical networks through publications. So to summarise, music and associated practices between 1642 and 58 are just very, very complex. Due to the vacillating power struggles between state and religion, this changed lifestyles for everyone. The inconsistent censorship created numerous issues for playwrights and composers, but this inadvertently created new art forms. The underground theatre scene highlights the demand for theatre, as does the increasingly strongly worded ordinances. Cromwell and Parliament publicly denounce theatres and associated activities, but partake of them themselves in the cause of entertaining guests. Musicians can play, but not entirely be seen to be playing. There was an increase in private home music and dancing and private concerts, which in turn assisted with the popularity of the published works that are mentioned. Ballads were still being sold and sung in the city. The taverns and inns had been given organs from the churches that the interregnum's rule had removed. And finally, all in all, this shows us that music and dancing, while at the core did not change, its use, its implementation, and its ever-changing circumstances encouraged and enabled some very unique performances. So I would like to finish by leaving you with one of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite books. I use these a lot, and I keep reminding myself about grass being greener and all that. But I would like to thank you very much for your time, everyone, and do feel free to ask me any questions.
Thank you, Natalie. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I, for one, am really glad that music continued throughout this period, and it seems there was as much hypocrisy as there was music, really.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
I'm glad that it, because we were always told there wasn't any, like you said in the beginning, and I'm glad to hear there was. So to start with some questions,
okay.
When you were playing all the songs earlier, Harry Hayfield asked, is it correct to state that most of these songs would be classed as plain song? And if so, does this reflect the Puritans' commitment to nothing disturbing the worship of the Lord? Was that why they were simple, I guess?
The metrical psalms definitely were that way. The metrical psalms were very much, they could be single line music or in unison. Quite sometimes they did have harmonies to them. If you think about going, you know, if you've ever sung in a church, even today, there's always somebody who wants to sing the harmony part to a hymn, always, or that maybe that's just the church I've gone to. But yes, certainly the songs I played were the ballad songs, and they were very much about entertainment. They were about getting a story across, so they very rarely had any other purpose than to have a single line. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm explaining that. I wouldn't call them plain song.
Okay.
Exactly.
Perhaps Harry will come back with a comment.
Yeah, that's fine.
Lindsay Shaw Miller says, could you please also clarify the date of the anecdote about Lestrange and his informal consort being interrupted by Cromwell himself? She thought she heard 1662, but that
sorry, yes,
so 1652.
No, he wrote that in 1662 as a little pamphlet and sort of like a memory thing. But he actually, this experienced it. I think it must have been, I will look. I might get back to you on that. Just bear with me while I go through my notes, but I'm sure it was about 1654 or 5. But I will double check.
Okay.
Don't quote me. But yes. But carry on asking me and I will look.
Well, Cromwell died, didn't he, in
58, yes, 1658.
1658, so I guess it must have been before that.
Mhm.
Unless he was haunting. And Anne asks, is there any evidence that dance was performed in private households during this period? I think you referred to that actually and said there was quite a lot of dance.
Yeah, there was just tons of it all the time. I mean, people, we've got evidence of people mentioning, so like the Duchess of Newcastle, Lady Newport. I mean, obviously these are quite elite individuals, but obviously people would have danced, you know, and things like that. So the answer is absolutely yes, they danced all the time. The publications we have, I mean, obviously even things like the Dancing Master, we had 51, 52 and 1659 that was continuous. You have events going on all the time, like weddings, and like I say, even though there wasn't those big public events that we, you know, everybody joining with the big dancing and the theatre things, people were doing this in private because they could get away with it in private. You know,
yes,
so
they obviously couldn't go around the houses checking on everybody, and if you didn't have your neighbours telling on you, as it were,
that's precisely it. As long as, you know, like I say, if it was private and nobody found out, it was okay.
Talitha says there was definitely dancing in Claypole Manor, Northamptonshire, when Oliver Cromwell's favourite daughter Elizabeth presumably was married to John Claypole in 1646, and Cromwell danced, even though you did mention that he wasn't a very good dancer. So
Annette, I think David Pinto wants to ask it.
Thank you. It's possible to butt in. I mean, I very much admire this attitude that the Puritans took music apart and rebuilt it. Yes, I mean, that's obviously it. But the evidence from the 1630s of what music survives in dance form is it was actually copied by Puritans. And one misses, I think, the substratum is that when you don't have the wireless or whatever, what you do is you dance. You have to dance. It's your social life. And it was part of them. And when they put restrictions on theatres and race coursing and so on, it was to disencourage assemblies of royalists in public, which were extended and which anything could be passed by.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, like the Cortes, for example, in 1655. A lot of these were from the 1630s, as you mentioned, and there's a lot of dances within there as well. And like I mentioned, the Virginal book that was 1655, but originally published in 1611. Again, that music is continuing. So whilst we do seem to have this idea that music stopped and became stale, nothing happened, and it's far from the truth. I think the art evolved with how it could in the environment that we had at that time.
Yes, thank you.
And if it meant recycling, I think it could be a word, or rebuilding it and things like that, and it would have, you know, that's just, as you said, it's part of music. Dance was just part of everyday life.
Yes, if I may add, there are part books of Cromwell's which survive, which has got masses of dance music, mainly by John Hingston. A few. There's a sequence by Charles Coleman, who was still around in the 1650s, and it's just purely dance, nothing else.
Yes, and there's an awful lot of that, and that's why, I mean, I know I didn't seem to mention a lot of dance in this, because it was just all the music seemed to be for dancing, whatever that might be. I'm just using the books that I used in the examples that I used, but like I say, there was like pavans and the sarabands and you know, they just carried on, and I'm thinking, Oh, okay. So
I mean, what else do you employ musicians for apart from to give you dancers?
exactly.
And they're not much use for anything else, are they?
Well, David just mentioned some names there, and that might answer Anne's question. Anne Hinchcliffe asks, can David P. give sources for dances noted by Puritans, please?
I've written about this in the past. There are some part books in Christchurch, Oxford, which were compiled around about 1630 to the mid-1630s, and they were by people known to be Puritans. And it's a very Catholic range. There's a bit of William Laws, who was at court. There's lots of John Jenkins, of all people, who was not at court. He was in private households, but they were soaking up this music, and they probably did so from the ambience of the Inns of Court in London, where everything met together and all the gentlemen danced, you know, and I don't know who they danced with, but they certainly danced. So Christchurch, I mean, I can't remember the actual shelf marks at the moment, but it's all there and searchable. A very good online category. Yes.
Thank you. Another source asked for, Natalie, Jan Gayat asks, who was the singer in your musical examples? It was a singer? It was probably
yes, it was. It's actually on the English Broadside Ballad Archive, and it's the clips that they have. So I can look that up. I'm afraid I didn't.
Oh, you can look it up.
But yes, it is on the archive system itself. So anybody can look that up, but I can do that.
And one more from Anne Hinchcliffe. I've actually pronounced your name correctly this time, Anne, sorry. As well as pavans and sarabands, what other dance types were in the books? Were there country dances?
Funnily enough, not in these particular books, because the books that I've seen at the moment, they don't mention country dancing. The country dancing is more on the theatre side of it. The dances I've seen in these particular music books are your sarabands, your pavans, your galliards, all those there's a lot of currants going on, curantos and things like that. So yes, but the country dancing I find tends to be more in the visual theatre side of it at this stage.
And one last point from Talitha. Was it not the case that dancing was mainly objected to in the context of religious festivals rather than elsewhere, I guess? So because there were dancing in religious festivals.
There was a big thing about not dancing on the Sabbath or the Lord's Day, and that message seems to continue. And yes, it was also about trying to not have great big groups of people together that might cause trouble, particularly royalists and things like that. Right. So, like I say, the interesting thing about this, and almost this, I don't want to use the word hypocrisy, but it kind of is that there was so much private dancing going on, and people were partaking of these things and entertainments and things like that, but they just weren't doing it in public, and as a result, yeah, I get very cross about that, actually. I start getting a bit riled about the injustice of it all, and I carry on like that. But at the end of the day, it was more to do with religious observances, and as long as you would within the law, and like you said, Annette, as long as your neighbours weren't watching and aware of what was going on and not telling, then it didn't matter if you danced indoors, as long as you weren't being very raucous, I suppose.
It's all fascinating, and we could probably go on for hours, but we better not. Thank you.